So good afternoon, everyone. I'm David Weinrich. I'm a Zuckerman Fulbright uh, Fellow at the at Technion Israel Institute of Technology, and I'm going to talk today about transit governance and its relationship with fragmentation of transit services. As a transit rider, you may have noticed sometimes how transit routes do not go to a key work site or go to in a circuitous direction, sometimes requiring a transfer from one system to another in order to make a short trip. And the question is how transit governance could play a role in some of these route decisions. Here's one example from Detroit. In 2015, a newspaper interviewed a Detroit resident who had to spend over 4 hours traveling from his home to his work site up in Rochester Hills, a small suburb outside of Detroit that is not part of the area's transit system. And this sort of illustrates some of the institutional impacts on transit services. You can see how he would take one bus from his home in Detroit to the county line, and there he had to wait for a second bus from a different transit system, transfer there, and untimed transfer, and then go to his worksite in Rochester Hills, which is not part of the system. So he had to walk the remaining couple miles from the bus to the work site, and then coming back the other direction at night. There was no waiting bus for him to take him from the county line to his home in Detroit, so he had to walk the remaining several miles. This is another example of institutional impacts from the Dallas-Fort Worth metro system. You can see all the green areas are places where transit lines, jurisdictions that have joined the system. Red are jurisdictions that opted out of the system during its original founding. And then hashtag areas voted at one point in time whether to leave or whether to stay, but ultimately decided to stay. And you can see the purple lines are where the actual transit lines go. And of course, they stick in the green areas that opted in. And also some of my research, we found that the hashtag areas had an important effect on the decision-making at the transit service, where they decided it caused just the vote on whether to leave or whether to stay, put the transit agency on its toes and influenced them to support a quick expansion of capital funding for new lines, rather than to serve areas that actually needed the transit. So that led them to expand quickly to areas in the suburbs with low densities, rather than the high density areas with low income downtown. We know from the literature that transfers can reduce ridership by about 25%, but also transfers that require a mode change can reduce ridership by 55%. So definitely we know that having multiple transit providers can be a problem. And but there are also ways to reduce and manage transfers, such as smart cards, app-based fare payment systems, shared transfer facilities, coordinated scheduling and timing of transfers, and shared maintenance facilities, also shared information across agencies. For example, if a large number of riders is taking one system, and they need to transfer to another line, the two agencies could be sharing, but if they're not well coordinated, it's difficult to do that. And then there are institutional solutions to all of these things. So a lot of these a lot of these things can mitigate the impact of transfers from one system to another, but they require a lot of coordination between transit agencies. So the framework for a lot of my research is looking at regional transit decision making, and then the role that institutions play in that decision making, with the theory being that a lot of these impacts would happen anyways, but they can be amplified or diminished by the impact of institutions, and in particular boundaries between agencies, and systems for coordinating. In the literature, we see several meanings of the word regionalization. The first being from the policy and service integration literatures, and the public choice literature. How can boundaries be overcome? This is looking horizontally between agencies that are that may be next to each other or overlapping. And then the second meaning of regionalization is the level of government that decisions are made. So if decisions are made at a higher level of government, like state, national, or supranational, the decisions can be less fragmented. And then for a given local government, there are different ways of overcoming fragmentation, like the basic organization of the transit agencies, whether it's managed by a county transit agencies, a regional planning authority, a state or a national or a supranational agency, and then also to what degrees boundaries are overcome. That question can be answered by mechanisms like interagency agreements, representation on multi-jurisdictional transit agency boards, or regional governments. MPOs are a regional planning agency in the United States, but the same would apply in other countries as well. And then and then the question of the scale of government, of course, depends on the level of government that's making the planning. And then there's the big question of whether local units can opt out of the system entirely, like we saw in Detroit and Dallas, and I'll come back to that in a bit. So for the one research project, we looked at 200 metro regions in the United States, and we looked at how the transit agencies were managed, coding for these different variables on the left, looking in, and then we recorded this for how each municipality was served by each transit agency and whether these variables applied to it. So we coded for whether the municipality was in a regional body that collects transit funding for operations from the, we also looked at whether the state government managed the transit service, whether it funded the transit service, whether they had a method for preventing local jurisdictions from opting out, which we called exit prevention. We also looked at whether there was interagency agreement between transit agencies that served that municipality. And then we looked at what we called conjunctions, which are examples where you have the same board member sitting on more than one government body, with the theory being that would improve the coordination between those two government bodies. So for example, we had a variable for whether transit agencies had board members that were shared. We didn't find very many in that category. But we also had a variable for whether transit agencies had the same board member as a county government. So we would actually look to see whether whether they had a permanent seat for a county representative on their transit agency board. And we did the same for transit agency to transit agency, MPO, which is the regional government, to municipality, regional government, MPO to county, and also MPO to transit agency. So we did all of those. And then we used metropolitan statistical areas as our unit of analysis. This is a unit, if you're not from the United States, you might not be familiar with this, but it's collected by the United States Census, and it's a regional statistical a calculation of data for the whole metro region, essentially. And it's based, the boundaries are based on commuting patterns and economic connections. So it's not actually a governing body or anything. It's a census statistical unit. But we use this for our research because it encompasses a large area, and its development is related to commuting patterns. This is the data that we found for looking at 200 metropolitan statistical areas in the United States. The blue ones, all of the blue and the red are fragmented, highly fragmented areas. We collected data on fragmentation, and then we collected data on regionalization, the variables that I showed you. And the ones that are white were low fragmentation. The ones that are blue were high high fragmentation, and also high level of regionalization, which was our word for the strength of ties between the institutional bodies in the region. And then the red ones were the ones that had low regionalization. So those were the ones where it was more problematic, the way that they organized their metro system or their transit system. I'll look here at a couple case studies that that illustrate some of the findings. These were the four that I'm going to talk about in particular. I talked about two of them a little bit just now. You can see that that especially the top three had a large number of counties in the region. All of them had a large number of transit agencies, but LA and San Francisco had the second and third largest in the United States after Miami. So 21 transit agencies in the metro region. That's a lot. And you can also see the cross-county commute flows in these regions. All of them have high levels of cross-county commute flows, except for Los Angeles region, where most of the commuters are traveling within each county. This is the Detroit metro region. You can see this map is shaded based on the number of overlapping transit agencies, with the exception of Detroit, which is kind of its own area. The Detroit area has a transit agency that does not overlap with the county surrounding it, and then the county surrounding it have a transit system that mostly sticks to those counties, but then has services that go into Detroit. However, they don't stop anywhere in Detroit except for the downtown. They won't pick up riders along the way. So it's a very strange system where they have buses going from one to another, but they will not pick up riders in a jurisdiction that is not part of their system. So a bus may travel through one of those enclaves, one of those little islands that are white, but it won't pick up riders, and then it will keep going. So there are many areas that are just not part of the system. This is because they created a regional service in 1967, but did not provide funding for it. So only jurisdictions that wanted to participate and pay the millage, which is a word there for a property tax, were able to participate in the system. And then Detroit was one of those jurisdictions that just did not join the regional system and set up its own. And a lot of this goes back to the history of fragmentation in the region, and a lot of racism involved in that as well. So I won't get into that whole history here, but the result is that the transit system is just not very well connected. There have been some efforts in recent years to try to connect these areas better. There was a regional transit authority ballot measure in 2016, but it failed in several of the counties. And then there have been efforts by the state government to try to encourage remaining counties that were interested in joining to do their own vote. And there have also been temporary measures to have better coordination between the two transit agencies through interagency agreements. So those are those connections are kind of ongoing, but they have a ways to go. This is the Dallas-Fort Worth metro region. This area has a little bit more overlap between areas. I don't know if you can see when I use the pointer, but you can see some of these areas do overlap. But then there's also large areas that are just left out of the system entirely. In this metro region, they also have the limitation that, and this is another element of how governance can affect transit decisions. They have a limitation on the sum total of all sales taxes that a local jurisdiction can raise, and that money can go to a lot of different things. It could go to stadiums, it could go to schools, many different things, and so you have this situation where the transit agencies that proposed to the voters to fund public transit back when that law was originally passed in the early 1980s, like Dallas especially, they went to the voters early on and asked for as much money as they could. So they have a 1% sales tax going to public transit. But counties that didn't ask voters soon enough ended up spending some of that money for other things. And like stadiums, for example, was in the case of Arlington. So that money now, if they were to go to the voters, they don't have as much of a budget, you could call it, for transit. So that also means that you have jurisdictions today where you have Dallas that has a 1% sales tax, and then you have Fort Worth where they have a 0.5% sales tax. So it'll be difficult for those two to ever coordinate because they have over far into the future, they have different budgets for public transit. So it's just hard to have the same level of services. They have, and there are jurisdictions that just did not join at all. Like Arlington didn't decide to put any money into public transit. Every time that goes on the ballot, it has failed. So that money, almost all of it is used up on a stadium budget now. So now they're basically funding their public transit with city contracts with private companies that provide just a stopgap transit system. They have also overcome some of their boundary jurisdictional fragmentation with interagency agreements. So even though Dallas and Fort Worth have different levels of budgets, they were able to work together to put together a commuter rail system that goes from one to the other. Some of those that money is all voluntary, so there are limitations to that solution because, for example, some of the trains on the rail might go to the county line, but not go all the way into the other county. But at least you do have a service that they can coordinate on, and most of the trains do go across. This is another example. The two examples from California are from a state where they don't allow local jurisdictions to opt out of the transit service. So in the Bay Area, all the white areas on this map not being served by transit are in the bay or the ocean. So so this area is sort of a different kind of fragmentation. They have service coverage for the whole region. That's not a problem there. Their challenge is that they have so many different transit agencies, 21. So to coordinate services across all of those is very difficult. They have 20% of riders in the Bay Area transfer at least one end of the trip. And some of those riders, some of those transit systems have transfer rates as high as 42%. They have different fare policies among their transit systems as well. Like, for example, they define age differently. Their schedules aren't synced. Late night services have always been a challenge. They have them, but they're very minimal. And now even worse with COVID, of course. They also have different funding structures in these agencies, which makes it difficult to coordinate. So so they have this is a kind of a California term, but they call it local option transportation taxes, which are basically a ballot box measure of whether to fund public transit or roads. They also use them for roads. Most of these taxes are one county. Some of them are across into two counties. So that makes it possible to coordinate across county lines, but it also limits the scope of the coordination. So you might have a transit agency that only covers two counties. And then you also have the Bay Area Rapid Transit System, or BART, has a property tax that covers 3 of these counties. And then there's bridge toll funding, which has been able to cover 9 of the counties in the metro region. So basically the entire metro region with bridge toll funding. And they don't have a lot of bridge toll funding, but they've been able to use it for coordination purposes that some of the local option transportation taxes weren't able to fund. So for example, they've used bridge toll funding to support late night bus services from one transit system to another. They've used them to support a smart card that covers all counties in the metro region. It took years to get every transit provider to agree to opt into that smart card, but at least they have it. And then they've also supported intermodal terminals, and and also retrofit of the BART system, which was one of those examples where it just seems so basic that they should fund earthquake retrofitting. That's a public safety issue, but the different counties had different local option transportation taxes, and neither county wanted to pay for retrofit of a service that went to another county. But eventually they used bridge toll money for that. So bridge toll money is one way that they've been able to overcome their jurisdictional barriers. Another way is joint powers agreements, which is just another term they use locally for interagency agreements or interlocal agreements between transit agencies. So these are sort of like the commuter rail in Texas. They're a voluntary partnership between county transit commissions, and they can support cross-jurisdictional services. But the downside is that they're voluntary, so each county has can decide over whether to put money in or not, and they're also vulnerable to shocks in the system. Like some of these joint powers authorities have been the most vulnerable to funding shocks from COVID. So joint powers authorities also could mean, in theory, that you might have a transit line that goes to the county line but doesn't continue. I haven't seen a lot of that in the Bay Area, though. They don't seem to have that problem as much as Texas. So this whole system in the Bay Area, you have 21 transit agencies, multiple counties. You just have an interlocking system of agreements that have evolved in a piecemeal fashion over decades. So their challenge in the Bay Area is just the need to coordinate it.
Hey, David, it's Greg here. Could you perhaps give us another 10 minutes max? So that'll leave us 15 minutes for questions. And I just encourage people who are listening to kind of get the questions in the chat function now so that we can start to kind of cluster them, and we'll be able to get through quite a few. Thanks.
Okay, great. So this is the last of the regions that I'm talking about. This is the Los Angeles metro region. In contrast to the Bay Area, they only have 2 counties to worry about. Most of their population is living in Los Angeles County, so that improves the coordination within the county. They have a local option transportation tax that earmarks money for local transit agencies. So that structure encourages coordination from the county transit agency to the local ones. So they do have good vertical coordination within the county, between cities and between the county. Their problem in the LA area is the poor coordination across the county line. And there are 3 million people living in Orange County, even though it's a small percentage of the region. There's 12 million people in the metro, or in the metropolitan statistical area. So that's still a lot of people that are not really part of the LA transit system. They have minimal coordination across the county line through joint powers authorities, through a rail service that has voluntary funding from each county. So like in Texas, you have some lines that don't go all the way into the next county, because that one county didn't want to pay for that. You also have you have no regional tax for the commuter rail service, so that's been a weakness in the LA region. And then the other challenge is that because these counties don't coordinate very well, and because they have different funding sources, they have their own funding sources, their own local taxes. So they have talked over time about lines from, say, Los Angeles to Orange County, but each county has talked about a different right-of-way for that same connection. So that's just an example of the challenges that they face. You can see, looking at these 4 regions, the Detroit and the Dallas-Fort Worth region, where local municipalities can opt out of the system, they have a very high percentage of the population that is outside of any transit service at all. 27% of the population in Detroit, no transit service serves their municipality. 41% in Dallas-Fort Worth. But in San Francisco and LA, it's almost nothing. Almost the entire region is covered by at least some transit agency. in also 20% of the jobs and 30% in Dallas-Fort Worth are outside of the system. And you can also see the impact. In another research project, we looked at the impact of opt-outs of transit service connected to transit coverage, and you can see how they do. There is a close link between those two. Some of these the things that I've been talking about transit fragmentation and governance also apply to the next generation of transit services for app-based on-demand services. Just because they're often provided by private contractors doesn't mean that we can easily overcome that fragmentation. The governance structure still applies. And this is an example from the Dallas-Fort Worth metro region. All the different local apps that have been used for public transit services. You could see these are all different jurisdictions with their own apps. So it is very difficult to go from one to the other. And then even in the same jurisdiction, there are some examples where they have multiple apps providing transit in the same jurisdiction. Especially with regards to using app-based services as a feeder for public transit, you often hear people talk about them that way, that we just plan an on-demand service to feed into fixed route services. But we run into a lot of the same challenges that we see for fixed routes when there is not good coordination. So this is just one example in Dallas-Fort Worth of a station area that the one on the left is a station area that has an app-based on-demand service where there are no signs at all, no parking bays. There's just no physical infrastructure. So the riders get off and they don't know the service exists. On the right, they've put those in place. So it's easy for the riders to tell, especially if riders are coming from outside the area on the train. They might not know the city's local provider, or even how to download the app, right? Schedule coordination is a problem, especially for app-based services trying to serve a fixed route. If the fixed route service only comes once an hour, it's difficult for riders to get there in time. It's hard to even know what time your on-demand service is going to arrive. So in this research project that we did across the state of Texas, we looked at app-based services across the state, and we found a lot of these challenges. With regards to the fare, especially if you're transferring from an app-based service to a fixed route service, you have to make sure that the fare payment system is well coordinated, and also that the riders don't have to end up paying two fares for both services. That can be a major deterrent. But in the ones that we looked at in Texas, they were charging two fares because they were run by different agencies. Like, for example, in the one in Arlington, the city was running the app-based service, and then the Joint Powers Authority was running the commuter rail. So they just weren't coordinating with each other. Information sharing is also an issue when you have fixed route services that they have a schedule. They may have a certain number of riders taking the fixed route service. If they were sharing information, they could tell the app-based service that there's a large surge of riders coming on a particular train, have more app-based services in place to accommodate them. But in the examples that we looked at, they weren't sharing information. They didn't even know what we were talking about. Special event planning is also a problem. I won't mention the city here, but there is one city that we looked at where they were that they actually planned the timing of the app-based service, remember, it may not follow a schedule, but it follows a time window. It operates between 6 a.m. and 9 p.m., for example. In the example we looked at, they purposely planned the timing so they wouldn't have to serve large events. And we discovered that that was partly because of the incentive structure for app-based services. I won't get a lot into that, but the incentive structure for fixed route that we're accustomed to is more riders on the bus means lower cost per rider. But for app-based services, the city is subsidizing every single rider. They have a limited number of seats. So every rider is a new cost for them. So they didn't want to serve special events, and they cut off the service early in the night so they wouldn't have to. And I'll just go into the last slide here. So based on what about the findings from research on fragmentation and governance structures, there are a couple different areas that I think we need more research on in the future. This research that I've presented, it focuses entirely on institutional structures, formal institutions. There needs to be more research into norms, handshake agreements between agencies. This is more difficult to do, requires more surveys. And there has been some research on it already by Chisholm and others, but there needs to be more into that. Better understanding of specific regionalization measures, like, for example, state level transportation planning, regional level, taxation at higher levels of government, and roles of interagency agreements, particularly in binational transit arrangements. So this research here looked at the broad picture, but there needs to be more research focusing on each of these areas. There needs to be more research into the measuring the impact of institutional factors on services provided, not provided, service gaps, fragmentation. And then finally, research on the role of private transportation services, app-based on-demand services, contractors in overcoming jurisdictional fragmentation, and in also creating new forms of fragmentation, like through multiple apps. So that's everything, and I would be interested to hear any questions.
Great, thanks a lot, David, especially for recovering from the technology start that we had. So we've got quite a lot of questions. I don't know if you want to finish sharing the screen. People can come on camera and so on. We're not too big a group. We'll kick off with the first question. I'm going to go in reverse order here from Carol Martins. The same coordination issues exist for roads, building and maintenance. How is it solved there? Or is it solved there? Does it just matter less? Are there any models that could be used for public transit?
That's an important question. In the United States, at least, which is the area I'm most familiar with my research, this isn't as much of a problem for roads because the funding structure puts most of that money comes from the federal government for roads. They built the interstate system in the United States with 90% of the money coming from the federal government. And even for maintenance, a lot of that money comes from a national highway account. So this is really a problem for public transit because of the way it's funded. So almost nothing for operations comes from the federal government. That's why the research I did, I should have mentioned that earlier, but the research looking at the 200 metro regions focuses on operations budget rather than capital expenses. And we did that because the capital money can fluctuate a lot over time. And a lot of it can relate to political decision making. So we want to look specifically at operations, partly because it hasn't been talked about much in the literature, but also because it's steady over time and lots of data points that we could look at.
So if I can just sort of follow up on that, 'cause it's an
Yeah.
interesting point. Milos asks, it'd be interesting to hear, and obviously not across all of your case studies, but a bit more about the historical reasons for the setup, and maybe you indicated different approaches to funding. Are we sort of fixed where we are, or how have those dynamics kind of changed over time? Are we kind of at an equilibrium, or is it still quite dynamic? How the funding and the institutions are changing?
Oh, you want me to talk or the group? I wasn't sure.
To you, yeah, David. We're
Okay.
all eyes on you.
Okay. The I think there's going to be a lot of changes right now with COVID. I think we're in one of those periods where there will be some major changes, especially when different funding structures that we've put in place that have worked for a while start to show their weaknesses, like that joint powers authority arrangement that I was talking about, based on voluntary contributions. That arrangement is already starting to show problems for services that are where some of the jurisdictions are turning inward during a crisis and deciding not to fund services that cross from one county to another. They may find that those services, that they don't have a dedicated tax to support them, so they're the first to be cut. Whereas services that have a dedicated tax are more stable. So I think this is one of those periods where we're going to see a lot of changes. The last period where there were a lot of changes was the Great Depression, at least in the United States, and funding structure changed dramatically, from property taxes, using property taxes to fund public transit, to using state level gas taxes, for that's both for transit and roads. So yeah, I think definitely we're in a period of change.
Okay. I think we'll come back to COVID. I've seen another question come in, but one from Louise. So a lot of the discussion is about the formal coordination, sort of regulation, taxes. Have you been able to get a sense of the informal coordination going on between areas? How the pooling of resources gets agreed, sharing of strategies? Is there anywhere that seems to do that better than elsewhere? I guess would be interesting to know.
Yeah, there's been some research. I mentioned the study by Chisholm. That study looks in the Bay Area at sharing of resources and informal coordination of the different transit agencies. I mentioned they had 21 transit agencies in that area. I don't even know if it was the same number when he did the study. It's constantly increasing. So there has been some research looking at how these different agencies come to agreements with each other. The slow process of constantly working together and then gradually building trust, and then eventually getting to the point where they can agree to do a joint service. There's also there needs to be more looking at ways that funding can encourage coordination. So, for example, in the Bay Area is a great example for this because there's just so many transit agencies. But the smart card, some of my research, I looked at the development of the regional bridge toll in the Bay Area, and the bridge toll was used as a way to encourage local transit agencies to join the smart card, which they were very reluctant to do. But with that extra funding coming from the regional bridge toll agency, then they were suddenly more interested in doing it.
Yeah, I think that's really interesting. That how much of this is down to politics between adjacent areas. I think you kind of inferred that with the Detroit case study, and how much of that can be overcome with resources seems like an interesting area.
And I should also maybe I should also just mention that you know, it obviously I haven't studied other countries outside the United States yet. I'm going to be doing more of my research at Technion, looking at other countries. But I think the United States is an interesting example because so much of the transit money comes from below the federal level. And I think you see a lot of these same patterns in other places, but in the United States, they're kind of exacerbated by the fact that there's just so little federal money going to operations of transit agencies. And you don't see a lot of these patterns for roads just because they're still there, but they're just masked over by all the federal money.
Yeah, well, I'm sure be interesting. People share examples for you to look into, David. I've got perhaps time for another couple of questions. So one from Anna Herriman, who'd be interested to know if there are examples of joint powers authorities involving community-based transport providers, especially if they're in case study areas where there's a mix of fixed route and app-based services.
I can't name any specific examples, but well, actually, no, I can. Like in Los Angeles County, they have they have joint powers authorities that that share the same fare card with the county agency. So they're they've agreed to a joint powers authority that. Or actually, I should say it's really an interlocal agreement. That's, yeah, I don't know of any examples of what you're talking about specifically.
Okay, well, Anna, you might want to follow up separately with David just to drill down a little bit more into that. So I've got one last question, which may be maybe all transport seminars should have in them or do have in them. From Bern Grush, was there a sense of any impact of ride hailing or shared autonomous vehicles, that kind of direction? Is that where some of the app-based service variation was beginning to happen in the ride hailing end of the spectrum?
I should clarify that what I was talking about in the study is cases where cities or other governments were looking to ride hailing as a way to provide their public transit service. So they're similar to Lyft and Uber, but they're not the same thing. Some of them were even hiring Lyft and Uber to be their contractor, but there were a lot of municipalities that were really hoping that app-based services would be a cheaper alternative to public transit. So you saw a lot of them in Texas. That's why Texas was a great place to study that, because there were a lot of these services popping up. And also the federal government in the United States has been supporting pilot programs for these for app-based on-demand public transit providers. So there's just been a lot of them popping up, but they have not been coordinating. And inexplicably, the federal government it is funding the pilot programs across the United States, but they're not requiring them to coordinate with other transit agencies.
Yeah, so common theme that we seem to be creating something with some more institutional divides rather than thinking about how we can use it to reduce the ones we've already got. I'm afraid time's beaten us, and it's a shame. I'm really sorry, David, and to everyone attending, that we lost probably 5 minutes in by the time we've overrun a bit here with all the tech problems at the start, which I believe I'm to take all credit for. It was a really great presentation. I'm sure we could have spent a bit longer in discussion, but I think as a special interest group, you've really drilled down into just how complex these institutional relationships are, and shown some real rigor in terms of how we can begin to understand them. And I'm definitely interested in understanding more about how the politics affects the institutional decisions and the way things flow out. But I'd love to see some more of the international comparator work that you've got planned. So I'm sure everyone will join me in thanking David for his presentation. Please check the website. We've got more webinars forthcoming with smoother technology. Please sign up, and we'll share and make David's presentation available as well if you want to share that with colleagues. So thanks so much, David, and we'll speak again soon.
Great. Thank you to everyone. I really appreciate it.
Thanks. Bye-bye.